So welcome everybody, Happy New Year. It's really nice to at least know that you're out there, even though I can't see you, and I'm sure there's people I know out there. And hello, it's so nice to interact with people. So just a little bit about me before we get into the webinar. I am from the United States originally, and I'm now back in the United States. Right before this though, for the last 13 years, I worked in 4 different countries in Asia. My last international posting was in India, and that's where I met Parita and got involved with Toddle. And I've always worked in the PYP, I guess, since I was overseas. And one of the things I enjoy the most in the PYP is the inquiry aspect and the curiosity. And I've never felt in control taking over a classroom. I've never liked to be the center of attention. So the webinar is a little interesting for me in that aspect, but what I've enjoyed the most is actually the back and forth, the discussions, the dialogue, and the questions. So hopefully we'll get into that today. Get your questions, explore questions and inquiry, and thank you so much for joining. I know this is a hard time. I know it's hard to carve time out when you're just feeling absolutely overwhelmed. I understand that completely, but thank you for being here, and it's good to carve out some time to learn. All right, so this is just to kind of introduce the importance of questioning in the PYP. And this comes from Cindy Blackburn's visual guide to the PYP, which is on Toddle Learn. And it's really just a nice visual and a simple visual of the inquiry cycle. And if you look at it, it's a cycle. It's a cycle of asking and thinking and doing. And it's not just collecting questions at the beginning of a unit. It's part of the puzzle, and it's integral in the puzzle. And I think it's always good to look back at this visual to realize how important asking is, and that it really happens all the time. So we're going to get into that today. And questions are integral in the PYP. And I grew up in a traditional school system in the United States. I went to a public school in the United States, a place where answers were rewarded. And I know a lot of us did. And they still are in a lot of places. We still want the standardized test. We still want the end of unit test. We want to get a score. We want to know how we are compared to others. And I also understand that after last year, that we really are, after this, well, what's been going on this past year, we really want answers. But it's also kind of helped me realize that questions and not knowing has led to a lot of growth and a lot of discovery. We've seen this with science and what's happening right now with the speed with which the vaccines have been developed, and our growth with, well, my growth too in the United States with what's happening with race and division. There's been a lot of questions, and those questions have led to a lot of learning, and it's very important in the classroom. So I highlighted these. This is from the resource, Encouraging Student Questions in the PYP. So I highlighted actually all of them, but I do think that when students, if you look at the one, when students are empowered to ask questions, I think they trust the learning environment. So we're going to get into, the first thing we're going to look at is we're going to dig deeper into the role of the classroom or learning environment and how important that is in creating a culture of inquiry. Then we're going to learn some techniques for actually some questioning strategies after that. So we'll spend the first part really exploring the learning environment and how do we model questions and how do we create that sense of inquiry. And then we'll get into some of the questioning strategies after that. The resource that's on Toddle has these 2 parts as well. It goes into more depth, so I'll do what I can today to explore some of it, but please take a leap into the Toddle resource, and I am always open for questions, and we'll discuss that as we go through and at the end. But these are the 2 parts of the Toddle resource. So in a minute, I'm going to ask you why you're here, if you haven't already said. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey and hopefully provoke you to tell me a little bit about yours. So my journey began, teaching journey began in the US. I taught in a public school. I had 42 children in my class, and it was didactic, it was direct instruction, it was a big class. From there, I went overseas and I moved into Turkey into a first grade classroom. And that was my first experience with the PYP. And I don't really know what was happening at that point because it was my first experience. I'd never even heard of IB. I came from a very traditional background. And it just seemed like there were a lot of big themes going on. And then I settled.
Yeah, cut off for just like 5 seconds for me. I'm not sure if that happened with everybody. I think it was my internet. So sorry to interrupt.
You can hear me now, right? Is it okay now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, please let me know though if that happens.
Yeah.
So I moved into the PYP and I really settled in Japan. And it was I was there for 6 years. I was in Yokohama, and Japan was a place in that school where there were a lot of experienced PYP teachers, a lot of people who had been in the IB for a long time. And I settled in and I learned a lot. And what stood out to me the most was inquiry and how they did it and how you created that culture in the classroom. And I was fascinated and I really grew a lot as a teacher. It was also a time when I got onto Twitter and was really involved with PYP chat and met lots of great people, made connections. But it was really the beginning of my growth as an inquiry teacher. And I realized how important the classroom environment was. And I'd never really thought of that before. When I moved on to Bangladesh, I had to start again almost and think about the classroom environment again and realized I couldn't do anything. I couldn't jump in with my inquiry skills and getting kids to question because the kids I had weren't used to it. So we had to start again with the learning environment. And then in India, started a new campus. Started with a lot of people who were not familiar with the PYP, kids and teachers, some of the teachers as well. So I realized again that the learning environment was super important. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to pause, and I want you to respond in the chat because that's the only way that I'm going to hear from you right now. But I guess I want to hear a few things from you. I want to hear first, how are you coping? I've learned not to ask, how are you doing, but how are you coping? And I put up a mood meter. I've been using this a lot with my class. Recently, I've been taking a course on SEL. This came out of that, and it's a really good thing to use with students. I'm using it with you. So think about, just let me know how you're coping, because I want to hear. Think about why you're at this webinar and what's challenging with creating an inquiry environment. I just want to hear a few things, and you can put those into the chat, okay?
So Casey says coping through supportive colleagues. Everybody else, if you can put in your mood. Okay, Shreya says relaxed and ready to learn from everybody. Pratima says she feels calm. Nisha says she feels drained. Caroline says hopeful. There's excited. Neha says engaged. Oh wow, there's a lot. So Ricardo says optimistic.
Yeah, that's good.
Carmen says pleasant.
I like the pleasant. Yeah.
Isabel says curious. Uni says motivated to learn. There's oh wow. Priyanka says hopeful. Yeah, there's lots. A lot of it is coming. Mia says enthusiastic. Sonal says focused. Kanchan says irritated. Is that one of the words on the?
Doesn't matter. It's a good word.
I'm trying to find if there are words.
Yeah, the meter is done. The meter is kind of interesting because it's done on from lowest energy to highest energy, and from, of course, lowest pleasantness or to the most pleasant. And so I've been asking my kids, and of course, we had a big thing that happened, as you probably heard, in the United States with the storming of the Capitol building. And we had to, unfortunately, discuss that with the kids the next day, which we needed to. But after discussing it, the kids used to be pleasant and they were just calm, you know, because they were at home and just relaxed. And then they went up to like enraged and frustrated and furious. So it's a good thing to do. But anything that you want to put into the chat about why this webinar or questions that come up, please put them in there. And then Parita will stop and you're welcome to say them anytime or something comes up with the screen.
Amy says thoughtful. So Uni says, I like this mood meter. If we use it with the kids, this will encourage to say more than just good or okay. So thanks for sharing it, Kristen.
Okay, and there's a link to it once you get the web. There's a link to it there too. Yeah. Okay, well, let's excuse me. Let's get into just talking a little bit about the learning environment and how do we set that up for curiosity, for questioning. So you can see these are my kids who are outside because our learning environments are happening everywhere right now. These were kids this year were outside the classroom. Whenever I've asked students about the learning environment, or really adults as well, they say they need it to be safe. And you can't get into questioning until you have a safe learning environment. It's the only way it's going to work. So it's really important to establish that. So here's some ideas for establishing that learning environment. So from the very beginning, it's important to engage students, set up the environment and expectations, and spend time doing that. Throughout the time, make sure that you're with the kids and you're with the students at their level. Solve problems together. We have to remember to have fun and to laugh together. And also to know our students well. I mean, I think there's nothing more important than that, to know, like, are they on the cricket team? Are they really into gymnastics? Do they love, right now, they love this video game, so they play all the time. So it's important to know your students and to set up a really safe learning environment from the beginning. And I want to know, I guess, what stops us from taking the time to do that? Because I know that it often is a struggle. It is a challenge to take the time to set up a learning environment. So what stops you from setting up that learning environment and from making it safe and taking the time to do that? I know, I'll give you an example. I know this year it was hard because the students had been out of school. They had been remote learning since last March, and we went in person at the beginning of the year. And everybody wanted to get right into curriculum because we felt like the students had lost a lot of it. So it was hard to say, wait, we need to take time to do this. This is important. So what stops you? You can put anything into the chat. What stops you from really taking the time to do this?
Emma says that what stops her is just the crowded curriculum with all the pressures around the curriculum. There was also Shiny also said, it's a challenge to how do you do this in a virtual environment, right? I think that's one question that's definitely going to come our way. Salima says it's the different subjects areas and timetable. Shreya says just time constraints around curriculum goals. Timothy says too much pressure on the standardized curriculum. So a lot of the same sort of thoughts coming out. Neeta says I've been enjoying my one-on-one conferences with the kids. So she's been doing some work on building a strong learning foundation, learning environment foundation with her students. Wing says, for me, it is the limitation of remote learning, trying to support students in their curriculum, trying to incorporate the curriculum at home with the limitation of time to teach. So yeah, lots of challenges in there.
Yeah, it's hard, and I completely understand. But I guess if we think that I do believe that that's one of the most important things we can do, and this slide also presents that, is setting up the learning environment from the beginning. And if we don't do that, and we don't have those relationships, and we don't have that safe environment, we are not going to get into inquiry. We're not going to get into that curiosity, that wonder, the agency piece. That's so important in the PYP and in really any kind of education system. So it's hard. I totally understand. And I've been on the administration side and I've been a teacher, but we have to figure out how to carve time to do that. And this comes from Ron Richards, The 8 Cultural Forces That Define Our Classroom. And this has just been re-envisioned with classroom, with questioning. So think about these times as you create your classroom, that you create time and opportunities and those routines and the structures. The language, we're going to talk more about that, about not answering, about modeling, and of course with relationships. And I understand the remote teaching piece. I was scared. I was moving into a new classroom in a new school in a new country. And I thought, oh no, I'm going to be remote from the beginning. How am I going to ever do this? I'm luckily and very privileged that we got to go in person and we had structures in place to do that, so that I had a relationship with the kids before I went remote. but it's hard, and it's hard with bigger classes as well. But these are some of the cultural forces that do define our classroom and that we need in order to set up a questioning culture. All right, I'm going to ask you to do something now. I'm going to show you some images from the New York Times. This came out at the end of 2020, and I'm going to show you some of these images, and I'm going to model some questions, because one thing we need to do as teachers is we need to model questions that provoke the students. So I'm going to model some questions based on one of these images. They're very provocative if you haven't seen them. And then I'm going to ask you to write down some questions. So you're going to need some paper, or you can do it on your computer, or you can just scratch it on somewhere. You're not going to have to turn them in. But I'm going to ask you to ask some questions as well. And I'll just show you how we look at questions and how you can bring them into your classrooms. And images are a great way to do that. All right, I'm going to start with this image. Hopefully you can see that okay. I will show you what it is. You don't have to tell the students. You could just put up an image. We did that with what happened just a few days ago at the US Capitol. I put up some images of the US Capitol and the rioting that happened, and put up images of Black Lives Matter protest. And we did a lot of notice and name, and it was fascinating and really a great way for a discussion. So here's an image. I will show you what it is. It's from Wuhan, China, January 24th last year. So I've got this image up, and I'm modeling some questions in the classroom. Wow. Like, I'm not going to say what it is exactly. I'm going to say, wow, what are all those things? They're so small. Oh, I think I know what those are. Why are there so many of them? Wow. And what are they doing? And oh, if they're building a hospital, that's going to be a really big hospital. How are they going to do it so quickly? And why do they have to build a new hospital? And how can they possibly do that right now? And what does this mean? And oh no, is this coming here? And so there's a lot that comes up with this, and there should be a lot of wow, because we don't really know. And that's what we want to do with the students, is model that curiosity. So not an answer. These are a lot of bulldozers. They're creating a hospital. It's more, wow, there's a lot of that. Why are there so many? How can they do it? It says here in 10 days. How can they do that in 10 days? And why do they need to do it in 10 days? Now these images are a little scary. So you wouldn't share these to your students necessarily, but you're adults, so I'm showing it to you. Now I want you to write down some questions that you have based on this picture. And I don't know if you can see the description underneath. It does come from Wuhan, China, but just jot down a few questions right now that came up as you're looking at this. And I'll ask Parita just to read a few, just any questions or any wows or.
Alona, so Alona is asking about a more overall question, which I'll take later in just a second. But if you guys, yeah, Zamanjeet says, I wonder what happened to the man lying on the floor. Timothy says, why is the old guy on the floor? Priya says, why are the two people dressed in white not helping the person lying down on the floor? Nisha says, why is the street deserted? Emma says, why are they wearing that? Neeta says, I'm wondering why no one is helping me. Sabah says, how are they feeling? Says, how long has he been there? Who clicked this photo? When did this happen? There's lots of great. How did this happen? How does this photo impact the family of the man on the ground?
Wow, yeah. Great questions. And I think that these are the things that we need to model to the students, that we need to model the questions. And again, not the answers, but the questions. And pictures are a great way to do this. And in the resource, there's also a link to some very provocative photos that you can use. They're not this necessarily, but you can find a lot out there. And they're great to use. They're great discussion points. I think kids, in particular younger ones, can really focus on images and say a lot about them and come up with a lot of questions that way. Let me see here.
Thank you everyone for the questions.
Sorry, I need to get back here. Hold on a second. I think it skipped a little bit. Oh no, never mind. Okay, let me go back to this, sorry. Yeah, so it's important that you model questions. And also, I wanted to bring up that we need to really think about not answering. I think that is one of the hardest things. When somebody asks a question, what do? We answer it. So I think that I put this book down, Choice Words by Peter Johnston, because it's a great book. It's about literacy, if you haven't read it, but it's really about words you use and how you respond. And I think it's super important because, if possible, respond with a question if you can. And don't respond with an answer, because we want answers. Everybody wants answers, but that stops us from thinking. So respond with a question if you can. And just think about it. Kind of pause before you respond, because we all want to respond with an answer. But we don't have the answers. And I've learned that in the last year especially. Nobody has the answers right now. As we're asking questions, ask metacognitive questions. And this again is from the resource, so there's some more information there. Ask questions like, how did you figure it out? Or what problems did you come across? What makes you say that? I ask that all the time. That's from the Visible Thinking, from Project Zero's, one of their Visible Thinking routines. But ask these metacognitive questions, and don't let students get away with one-word answers. It's okay, that's fine. I've really seen growth in the students I've had this year. I know at the beginning of the year, for many different reasons, but when I asked them, how's it going, or what are you doing? And I wasn't asking the right questions, but they were responding with, it's okay. Oh, I did fine. It's good. But now I just actually listened to some of their reflections yesterday they did on an essay. And with the right questions, wow, they had such reflective ideas, such reflective things to say. So they've grown, and it takes a while. But if we keep asking questions, those metacognitive questions, we will actually encourage deeper thinking and more critical thinking. And you can see that here too. The kind of questions you ask will lead students into more critical thinking. So this is just looking at this. You can see the resource there. But we do tend to ask a lot of those remember questions. They're the easiest ones, right? But we need to go past that. So like if we're looking at a piece of literature, for example, one of my favorite books is Wonder. And the character in there, I'm sure everybody knows it, but the character in there has a facial deformity, and he's a 5th grader and he's going to school for the first time. And there's lots of remember questions I could ask. Oh, like, what happened when August went to school? Or what do you remember about what happened with the bully? Okay, so there's a lot of remember questions that you could ask your students, but try to move them up so they're thinking a little more deeply. And that really is up to us to ask the deeper questions. So I might ask with the book Wonder, for example, I might say things like, Via's sister sees August as extraordinary. So what does this really mean? And let's try to evaluate what that means, even using the words there. So again, ask follow-up questions, move students through Bloom's taxonomy with questions so that they start thinking more deeply. And of course, then their questions will also become a little bit more deep. Right. And kind of closing off in the about the learning environment. Again, there are more ideas on the Toddle resource, but think about silence. It's one of the most important things you can do to encourage questioning. It's to give learners a chance to think, to be silent, which I'm doing right now. And we want to fill the words, we want to fill the space, but give them time to think, because a lot of people just need extra time to think. So the second part of the resource gets into core strategies, and that's about how to teach students to ask questions, all right, and actual strategies. So this is one, a lot of you might have used this. This is from Visible Thinking, from the Project Zero. So in this one, you have students brainstorm a list of 12 questions about a topic or a concept or an idea. And then they star, highlight, or circle the most interesting ones, the most interesting questions that they feel they want to discuss, all right? And then you ask what new ideas have come up. Question starters, like you see on the right, are really important. And these help students form their questions. So I'm going to ask you, we're going to kind of look at this right now. So we've been talking about setting up a learning environment. and questioning, and what questions for you have already come up during this presentation. Use a few of these sentence starters, like question starters, I should say, like why or what if, to help. Like you might say, one of my students are young and they can't come up with questions. Or what would change if my students were EAL? So see if you can write down a few questions. We can say a few now, but at the end of the webinar, you can bring forward those questions that are the most important to you. So write down a few questions that have come up for you so far when we've looked at the learning environment. You can use some of these question starters to try to figure out a few questions you already have about this webinar, or things that are still in your head that haven't been answered. And you can use some of those question starters. And if you want to share any, I'm open to listening to some of them, or we can share them at the end as well.
Kristen, do you want me to read out some of them?
Yeah, if there's a few questions, we can look at those. If there's things that have come up so far.
So Damanjeet says, starter for this one, what if I don't have the answer to one of their questions? What if, yeah.
So good questions, keep them coming. Of course, what do I want to do? I want to answer your question. But I think it's a good question. And what if we don't have the answers? Is that what we're worried about? Is that what that makes us anxious about creating an inquiry culture? Is it that we don't have the answers? That's a lot easier to teach from a textbook with answers. But what if we don't have them? What does that do for the classroom? What does that do for us? How does that have, how do the students look at us? I think that's a really good question, and one that can lead to a lot of other questions.
Eric says, what if students are not motivated to participate? That can be intimidating as well.
Yeah. And we'll come back to a few of those. But yeah, just keep thinking about those sentence starters or question starters as you do ask your questions. Another way you can ask questions, and you can help students to ask questions, is to use DeBono's thinking hats. And this, you can use these for answers as well, but since we're talking about questions, if we look at these with questioning, you can use the different colored hats to elicit different types of questions and to have students ask different types of questions. So I'm going to go through these DeBono's thinking hats. Let's take the idea or this topic of remote learning or distance learning. And I know many of us, if not all of us, have been involved in distance learning over the past year. So if we use DeBono's thinking hats to question, not answer, but question about distance learning, we might do it like this. So the blue hat is about thinking. So a question I could have about distance learning with the blue hat is, how has your thinking changed about distance learning? So really looking at that process. If I wanted to come up with a question for the red hat about distance learning, I might say, how do you feel about remote learning? Just general, how do you feel about it? For the yellow hat, I might have a question about distance learning or remote learning. I might say, what have been the benefits of remote learning? And there honestly have been benefits of it. It's hard to admit that, but there are a lot of benefits of it. Questions, white. The white hat is closed questions. So those are facts. So what were some outcomes of distance learning during the pandemic? Like what happened to test scores or what happened to students learning? So we could ask a question about that. The black hat is focused on challenging and critiques. And I've had this question actually lately as I've been reading a lot of statistics, but what if students haven't lost anything during distance learning? What if they've actually gained something and learned something? Because there's a lot of things out there like, oh, they're losing their scores and their test scores are going down and yada, yada. But yeah, what if they haven't? And then the green hat is the creative. And so again, that's kind of, that's, if you remember that chart that went up from remember questions to create, the green hat, those are your creative problem, your creative and new ways of thinking. You might say, What are some new ways, now that we've done distance learning, what are some new ways that we can learn now? How can we bring this back into the classroom? Are there things we can eliminate, do differently? So DeBono's thinking hats you can use with questions, and you can teach this to students to ask questions using DeBono's thinking hats. And it's something to remind myself that I need to bring into the classroom, because I think it helps students get to deeper questions. So that's another strategy you can use. Now, I know that there are a lot of teachers are with younger students. And sometimes you're thinking, well, again, what if my students are too young? Like, what if they can't do those kind of more higher order thinking skills? Well, one, I think they can, but you can start with, and for anybody really, you could start with the 5 W's and the 1H. And a lot of us already do this, but to really make it visible and explicit, but teach students the who, what, when, where, why, how, and have them ask questions based on that and come up with a question for each. And that's just a simple way that we could start with questions and to develop the questioning skills. Make whatever you're doing, I'll show you another one in a minute, but make whatever you're doing with questions, make it visible in your learning environment. And we like to put a lot of different things on the walls and to put up projects. And I know, thinking about when we were back in the walls of the classroom, but we'd have lots of like final projects, and we might have some of our own work and things that look really good on the classroom walls. But we want to put up the process, and you know that. We want to put up the process, but we want to put up questions as well, so that we facilitate questions, and then we also teach students how important they are and that their questions are valued. And I know whenever I've done this with students, they're always like, oh, that's mine, that's mine. They want to put their name to the question. But we need to teach them that questions are super important and that they're really helping to drive learning. So make it visible whenever you do. It might look a little messy. You might have a lot of sticky notes that are up there, but it helps with the classroom environment, and it helps teach students that questioning is important and not the answers all the time. And I think, Parita, we have time. Do we have time to do one more?
We have lots of time. We're doing great on time. I also wanted to say, I don't know if I'm going to say this name right, but Koino says, I've used DeBono in class before, and it shot up their perception of perspective and gave them a really good basis for questioning. So yeah, that he already tried this before. And there's also a lot of, love for the fact that we should display student work, and learning should be messy. So that's in there too.
Yeah. And we know that, we all know that, but it's hard sometimes. We think, oh, they've done such a good, whatever it is, project, or they've done such a good thing. Let's put that up on the wall to show everybody. And I know I've been in schools too. I haven't taught them, but I've been at schools where, your walls need to look neat and they need to have certain elements. And then sometimes that doesn't allow us to put up this messy stuff and these sticky notes and the thinking process. But I think it's really important.
Yeah. Kristen, do you want to take 1 or 2 questions right now, or should we keep those for the end?
Let's take them now. Yeah, sure.
Okay. So Wing asks, how can we share their learning during remote learning? So if we were to make their questions visible, how can we do that during remote learning?
Yeah. Well, I think that, see, here I am trying to answer this question. We should try to get let's make sure that in the chat that give your suggestions as well. So I'll give some ideas, but please add your own suggestions if you've tried different things that worked, because we've got a great resource right now of everybody that's on. So I'm just going to give one idea or so. But I know that, of course, Toddle is a platform where you can use it. I know people that have used Flipboard. I've used Flipboard quite a bit. Does everybody, I don't know if people know Flipboard, but Flipboard, you can actually put out questions and students can respond with videos to that, and it's very visible. I think any platform like Toddle or Seesaw where you can put that out there. We do a lot of slideshows, Google slideshows, where everybody's got a different slide and they can add it. So in some ways it's like a big sticky note and they can put their own thoughts on that. We've used Explain Everything, which is an iPad app, but I think it might be only on the iPad, where you can actually explain your thinking and record it. There's a lot of good math apps where you can do that as well. So, is anybody writing anything into the chat for some ideas?
Yeah, there's lots of ideas. So there's Jamboard, Padlet, Flipgrid. So digital whiteboards in general have come up. Mentimeter is another one. I think Mentimeter is a good platform as well. Also, like questioning in Toddle is great because of this. Kono says that the discussion board in the classroom is a great way. So definitely for teachers who are already using Toddle, there's portfolios, there's discussion boards on a Toddle classroom, all of those that you can use very, very actively to collect and make visible questions in your classroom.
Yeah. I think in some ways it's kind of being remote and online has forced us to really think about how do we make it visible when the kids feel very far away, right? I know that like Zoom, I don't know how many people are using Zoom, but Zoom now has a whiteboard feature, so you can actually use that whiteboard. You can use annotations. I've been using Zoom, so I don't know as much about Google Meet right now, but the kids have been annotating a lot lately. They're like, in this picture, and they're like drawing on the picture. They get a little carried away. And Jamboard has been great also. I forgot about Jamboard. That's been great because you can assign different pages for different students and they can show all their thinking there. Explain everything. They can voice record, and they can voice record on Toddle and things too. So
they can. And I think like these are all also strategies. I feel like all tools that we're going to take back to the classroom, even when we go back to a face-to-face setting, just because they were so great in making the learning visible, right?
I think so. And see, I think that's, what there are benefits, I think, of being remote and having been forced into this and that, and what can we take back to the classroom and what can we eliminate? So can we eliminate that teacher talk, that hear yourself, I hear myself right now, but we hear ourselves on Zoom or on Google Meet, talking and it gets kind of boring. So we think, how can we get rid of that in the classroom a little bit? Yeah.
Great. We'll take the rest of the questions towards the end, Kristen.
Okay. Yeah. So just bringing up another questioning strategy is looking at conceptual questions, and this is important in the PYP, and it's something that we need to teach the students specifically what these different terms mean. I know that a lot of students and a lot of teachers too, when they come into the PYP, I myself included, when I first saw these, I thought, what does that mean? A lot of these didn't make sense. So we need to teach students these specific words and these concepts and how they can ask questions related to them. And we can do this with every unit. We could do it with every subject, actually. So these are the different concepts. So change, form, function, causation, connection, perspective, and responsibility. And I just put some example questions in there. And I was just thinking as I go back into the classroom and we're heading towards exhibition, I think we're going to really start focusing on this with the next unit. And what questions do students come up with each concept? And you can see there, like, how's the climate changing? Or you can look at it even with subjects like math, like how do you manipulate variables? Or how do we write a persuasive essay? We should be asking those concept questions about every subject. So that we are full of wonder in there. So let's look here. I want to hear some more from you, because enough about me. Let's hear a little bit more from you. What questioning strategies have you used? Someone mentioned DeBono's thinking hats, but what are some, and it doesn't have to be these strategies. I'm just curious, what other questioning strategies have you used in your learning environment that have been successful? So if you can put those into the chat and then we can look at those.
Nisha said she's used conceptual questions as a strategy. Alona says thinking routines. Ira says the question quadrant. Maxine and Timothy both say see, think, wonder. Question starts from visible thinking routines. Uni has used that before. What makes you say that? I think that's another routine. Someone's used that. Brainstorming for vocabulary is another one in here. Y chart and KWL chart. And yeah, see, think, wonder. This solo taxonomy is also something that I find really interesting in the answers.
Yeah, I didn't even get into that, but I do think, does Toddle have some information about the solo taxonomy? Do you have anything out there about
So,
that?
so we do. So we have some. It's part of the visual guide to the PYP, but we don't have anything standalone yet on solar taxonomy. That's something that we'd be happy to work on. Pia says question formulation technique, which is
And
really
that's,
great as well. And I think something that you've covered,
yeah.
Kristen, in your resource.
Yeah, yeah, I didn't bring that up here, but that's another one. Another one that's got a lot of structure. I think it's nice sometimes to have those structured routines that you can teach to the students and that they can use over and over again. Kind of like the visible thinking routines, because once they get it, then they can start to do it independently. Like I think a lot of kids all over the world can now do see, think, wonder, and
Yeah.
that's just through routine and through practice. And we can do the same thing with questioning. Yeah.
Yeah. Uni also says that she starts the day with a question, with a picture,
Hmm.
video, or just like a look at the sky activity. And do you have any
Hmm.
questions or something like that? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one. I think in the resource, it mentions a few things like Wonderopolis too. So that's a nice way to start off the day with Wonderopolis or having your own Wonderopolis. Or
Yeah.
again, with with pictures too. Or I think that's kind of cool to have a big question, maybe that they start exploring from the beginning of the day.
Yeah.
I think in the resource as well, we mentioned like having a curiosity corner or just some interesting, which is easier to do when you're in person, but I guess you could do it online as well. But just something that's a provocative artifact that they can look at, or a corner of artifacts that they can manipulate and look at and ask questions about. I
Yeah.
think those are really powerful. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So it'd be nice to, so we're going to try to compile everything at the end, right? And we can compile, it'd be nice to compile a lot of the different questioning strategies and some of the things that people are saying. I think that would be really important
Yeah. Yeah. For sure.
and nice to put out there for everybody. Okay, so just kind of coming back to this again is back to the asking, thinking, doing, and then I want to get some more questions from you and have a little more discussion, I guess, if we have time, about what's challenging for you. But this just kind of remembering that it's asking, thinking, and doing, and that we really want to make sure the entire environment and the entire learning process is fused with questions, and it's not just our beginning, collect it all, put it up there, and then we move on and teach. And I know that, again, I've been guilty of that, and it's easy to do, but that we need to make it a part of the cycle of inquiry throughout the entire time. So anything, your questions or your thoughts or just some actions that you've taken, you are all experts, and we want to hear from you, and it'd be nice to have a little back and forth as best as we can during a webinar.
So,
Something.
so Ida has asked this. Somebody else has asked this as well, and it's a question. Yeah, we've had this question repeat 3 times. It's
Uh-huh.
basically, how do you support students who are new to English? How can we encourage them to ask questions in a new language? Ida asks specifically for French. How can and tips for bilingual schools. So that's been a recurring question.
Okay. And again, kind of like with the last one, I think there were some really good answers. I will say a little bit about what I know, but please put in any responses that you have, because it's a great place to share things that you might have tried. Those that didn't ask the question, maybe others have some answers for that one. So let's keep putting those in the chat. But I know that like images work really well in bilingual or with students that are new to English. And I'm not an expert on this. I haven't actually been with students who are new to English probably since Japan. That was probably where I had the most students. But of course, in Bangladesh and India, it seemed like everybody spoke English. And of course, in the US. So I'm not an expert, but I do think that making sure that lots of images are used, and I think having the vocabulary is important. And some of those structured questioning routines will help with students new to English, because it will give them the vocabulary and the words that they need. So the why or the what, or just so that they have a routine to follow and the vocabulary to use. Because I think a lot of times, of course, or maybe they're saying it in their own language, depending if you've got translators. But I think the vocabulary is going to be key if you need them to do it in English. Otherwise, do it in their own language if they can, or draw it out, or use an image to do that. And I don't know if anybody else had some ideas for.
Yeah, I was thinking about this. I feel like the same strategies can work with ELA learners too, or in bilingual classrooms, right? All the strategies that you shared could work in those classrooms. There were Wonderwall was an idea that somebody suggested that would work using visuals and also sentence starters is what Regina says. Modeling and giving examples can also be helpful. Think, pair, share for wondering and questioning. These are ones that have come up. Yeah.
And that's a good point too. I think that part of, with everybody, and I would think with new to English in particular, having that safe environment and breaking it down. So for think, pair, share, it's a great idea, because if you don't have the vocabulary and you're not comfortable, you're not going to be sharing out with the classroom. You can't be expected to ask a question in front of your peers right away, especially if you don't have the vocabulary. So I think, pair, share is great, and kind of break it down so everybody has a chance, but not necessarily in front of the entire class to have to ask those questions. Or maybe they're just writing it or visualizing it or drawing it. And having the words too, I think, is important, even if it's just for those students, that they have the words that they need to dig into. It's hard with anything, right? But to dig into every subject, math and the unit and the different things that they study, they need the words.
Yeah. Diksha has a question. How do you encourage 3.5-year-olds to ask questions? She says, I pose simple, and it seems that she has to pose simple questions for the day, like, how are you feeling after the class? What are you going to do now? How can I encourage them to ask more meaningful questions?
Yeah, I think that, we know that and I haven't taught little ones. I've been around lots of little ones when I was a coordinator, but they have that natural curiosity, and they might not be asking questions that we believe are deep and thoughtful, but they have a lot of questions, right, all the time, and they should. And I think students that are younger students just need the opportunity to explore their questions and to be able to ask those questions, which means that they're not sitting and listening to us, that they're exploring in play-based environments, and we're listening to them. And I think we don't need to worry about teaching them the structures of these, until they get a little bit older, because I think it's naturally there. I think it's just sometimes they just don't have students don't have the opportunity because they're forced to go through a curriculum or something, and it's not a play-based environment. But if we listen in, I think their questions are amazing. Actually.
Yeah, just to add on to what you said, Kristen, right? In your resource as well, like the interesting corner, the antiques corner, or just something like that is very much like an earliest provocation as well, right? You could set up an interesting provocation for them to ask questions and really take it from there.
Yeah, and I do think, we just don't. I guess the hard thing is they ask. I remember having that discussion with some people when I was at Oberoi about they're just not asking questions. But I think in some ways that's us. It's us not giving them the environment, because kids are naturally curious, and then there's some reason they're not asking. It's because they don't have those provocations. They don't have those hands-on things that are making them go, oh, what do I do with this? Wow, and how does this connect? So I think it's up to us to provide that play-based and that learning environment, so they can just do it natural. Yeah.
Well, when you were sharing the books, that the Choice Words was one of the books. Neeta also said Opening Minds by the same author is a really great book. So for anybody who wants recommendations, you can take a note of that.
Peter Johnson. I haven't read that one. I'll have to look that up. But yeah, I just remember that was such a the book. We did a book club on that when I was at Oberoi, and it was just, and I'd read it before then. It was just one of those books that really changed me and just changed the way that I interacted with students, even though, again, it's based on literacy, but it's good about how to ask questions and not answer. questions. So I'd be interested in seeing opening minds too.
Another question was, Wing asks that, and how do you provoke quiet students to ask questions, especially in the remote setting? I think both in the classroom as well as in the remote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that a lot of things that we do, probably it's almost easier sometimes in a remote setting. I've noticed one of my very quiet students is actually a lot louder in the remote setting, which is, and I've been thinking about that and why that is. I have a lot of talkative students, so I think she just gets overrun. So I think in part, we need to make sure that the environment is, one, safe for that, but two, that we don't call on students who are always raising their hand, and maybe we get rid of hands altogether, and that we just set up an expectation that everybody's going to share something, and they're going to share it in the way that they need to share it. And also we do it in what someone had said earlier, I think pair share, like do it and so that they're sharing. They might just be sharing to their neighbor, who then can tell the rest of the group what's happening, but they don't need to be sharing in a bigger setting. So many people are uncomfortable with that, right? That they can't share in a group of 15 or 20 or 25, but they can share with one person. So we need to make sure they have lots of opportunities to do that. Another interesting thing I've done with when I've done book clubs or literature circles is they've done silent conversation. And it's like kids love it, and they just write. You know, it's all about writing your thoughts, and someone's responding to that, and then you're responding to someone else, and no one's talking. So sometimes try some things where it's not all oral, but they're actually doing some writing or some drawing to make sure that different learners have a chance.
Yeah. Uni says, I can connect with what Kristen said about the quiet child during remote learning. These children actually blossom during this learning environment. As we come back to school, they're feeling more confident as well. I think Uni's gone back in-person school as well.
Yeah. And we need to remember those children and how they responded, you know. And I think sometimes I realize with some of my students, like I'm paying more attention to them. Like I'm making sure they go, so what do you think? Yeah. And I need to remember to do that because sometimes we're just overwhelmed by all the students that are a lot more vocal. So
I think those are all the questions we have, Kristen. Yeah, if there's, I would recommend that everybody download the resource so you can use it and do workshops and mini PDs in your setting. So if you're a coordinator, you can do it with your teachers, you can do it with your colleagues. I think it's a great way to encourage questions, even with your parents. It would be really, you know, I think parents often ask the most simple questions, and getting them to ask more meaningful questions would be a really amazing way to sort of bridge that homeschool gap as well. So do download Kristen's resource. She's done an incredible job. Thank you so much, Kristen, for sharing all of this with us today. And it's always a pleasure to have you work with us.
Thank you. And thank you so much, everyone, for taking time to be here and to participate. And I wish you the best of luck.